we have to remember, we have to understand that Christianity, like any ancient faith, is not the only one that this is true of, has a really deep mythic structure, which we don't even necessarily understand when we read it on the surface. And if you read, I don't know, the story of Noah's Ark and see it as a literal story that's supposed to have happened sometime in time, and then you go looking for the boat on the mountain, you've missed the point. And similarly, if you dismiss the whole thing, as you say, as this kind of big metaphor, then you've missed the point as well. There's something in there that's speaking to the mythic structures at the heart of our existence. And that's the stuff we're missing in the West. That's the stuff we're missing. And however useful science and progress can be, without that sense of the mythic underpinning of what we are, the shape of reality, the kind of symbolic reality, then we're kind of all at sea. And I think that's where we are now. And whether we like it or not, our mythic structure in the West was built on the Christian story, which doesn't mean everybody has to go off and become a Christian. It just means that's where we are. That was the structure that our culture was built on. And now it's gone away, or we've gone away from it. So we're in this place. Yeah, the Tower of Babel is another one of those great stories I puzzled over for ages. I thought this is very strange stories of what's going on here. But yeah, this is everyone gets together and says, if we build this high enough, we'll get back to God where we should be. And it's also the one thing that's kind of implicit in the story is that it's getting back to God, but it's also avoiding the flood, because they just came out of a flood. And so they're saying, if we build up high enough, we'll reach to God, and then we'll also be safe if there are these waters. Because there's a tradition that says that the Garden of Eden was never, like in Senephrim the Syrian, there's a tradition that talked about how the Garden of Eden was never flooded, and that the water of the flood came up to the gates of the garden and never entered. So this image of this reality, which is above the chaos and kind of holds, and the man says, no, I'm going to build that. Like, I'm going to build a mountain, I'm going to build a thing that's going to avoid any problem. And like right now, if you understand, like when we look at the control measures of COVID that are being set into place, you get a sense that there's something of that where people think that they're going to create a world where there's no danger, where there's no risk. This is the machine, isn't it? Surely, right? This is the fall. This is what you do when you eat the apple, right? You say, I'm not going to trust God, which is the same thing as trusting nature, actually, because that's the creation, right? I'm not going to trust God. I'm not going to be in the garden. I'm not going to live within the natural law. I'm going to take control of everything, and I'm going to build a world which is better. And what that means is a world that's better for people. Okay, so it doesn't matter if we kill everything else to do that, and it doesn't matter if we end up actually putting ourselves into a kind of slave state where we have no freedom either, because at least we're in control. So it's this desperate grasping for too much order. And then the pendulum swings, and in comes the chaos, which is the climate change, which is the extinction, which is the cultural disintegration, because that's what happens if you try power without wisdom. And I find that the more I read the story of what happened in the Garden of Eden, the more I'm interested. The great myth of Eden. And again, you don't have to be a Christian to be interested in this. And of course, it's not exclusively Christian. But, at the beginning of everything, humanity is in communion with nature and in communion with God. We're all in a garden together, right? We're in everything's alive. All the creatures are there. Everything's been created. We're all together. We're so close to God that we can see him wandering about in the garden and have a chat with him under the trees, right? That's where we are. And God says, look, the only thing you shouldn't do is eat from this tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, okay? Because you're not ready for that yet. Maybe later you can have that, but you're not ready for that. You're young, you don't know anything. So just, everything else is good. Stay in communion with the garden. So we've got this kind of indigeneity, this primal indigeneity in the garden. We're totally connected to nature. And then along comes the serpent. And of course the serpent says, yeah, you know what? God really wants to keep the truth from you. And the truth is that you can be better than him and you can be God yourself. So why don't you just eat that fruit and then you'll find out. So we do. And we say, oh yeah, look, we could do what God does. But of course we can't, because we're not able to do it, because we're not ready to do it. And so out we go. We chose to leave. That's what the fall is. The fall is a choice to step away from God. And that's what the word sin means. The word sin is originally a Greek word. It's an archery term. It means missing the mark, right? So when you sin, you're missing the mark being getting back into communion with God and nature, right? God and creation. So we're endlessly missing the mark all the time because we want the power of the knowledge of good and evil. So we chose power over communion. We chose triumph of the will over humility. The Christian story being that then Christ has to come down and remind us what we were supposed to be doing and show us a way back. So he's giving us a path back to the garden. And again, I don't think you have to be Christian to be interested in that story. When I look at it that way, I think, okay, this religion that I used to think was irrelevant and oppressive and nothing to do with anything, actually, when you take the teachings in that way,
they've got a hell of a lot to tell us about where we've ended up, because we're still in rebellion, right? We're still in rebellion. We're still eating the apple. Every day we eat the apple. And we say, oh, yeah, I can do better than this. I'll upload my mind to the cloud. I don't need to. Well, think of it that way. Then you see the technotopia as an attempt to create a technological version of the Garden of Eden that we can all live in forever, being immortal. We get a silicon transcendence. We don't need God anymore because we've become God. That's the story. And I find that a very powerful story, very interesting one.
And that New Agey stuff in all of its forms, including Wicca, which I was involved in, is a grasping by people towards a spirituality because they know they need it, but they don't want to go. They certainly don't want to go to the church, and they don't really like structure, and they don't like authority or hierarchy or tradition in any way, because that's what we're like in the West now, right? We reject all of those things. And the uncomfortable reality that I came to is you can't reject all of those things. You can't reject all the structures, the traditions, and the hierarchies. That doesn't mean you have to accept everything that happened in the past or unquestioningly just follow things. But it does mean actually that religions, again, religions exist for reasons. They're vessels. They're structures built around something that's believed to be a truth. And they exist to convey the truth in very imperfect forms because they're human constructions. And the Christians will be the first to tell you that humans have fallen and therefore they're going to mess stuff up, including their religious institutions, which happens all the time. So you don't expect your religion to be perfect, let alone the people who run it. But without it, you fall back on yourself. And I think that the fundamental Christian story, which I just keep endlessly coming back to, is the story of the fall. This is really what it starts from. And if you look at the fall, it's an endlessly happening thing. It's not just a thing that may have happened in time. It's a thing that's happening every minute to you. The fall is a story of humans that are in communion with God, and they're in communion with creation, and they're in communion and connection with everything else. And the one thing they're not supposed to do is eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because they're not ready for it. They're not mature enough yet. They're not wise enough yet. When they eat from that tree, they need to do it under God's guidance so they can use the knowledge of good and evil in a way that's wise and not selfish. But they don't do that. They're persuaded by the adversary, the little snake, to do it now, to follow them for themselves. And what's the consequence of that? Well, they leave the garden. They fall out of communion. We fall out of communion with everything else that lives. We fall into ourself, and we fall into ego. And from that follows farming and technology and the Tower of Babel and civilization and all of the things that we have now. All of which is a product of deciding to choose power over communion, to choose will, to choose the self. So you fall away from God and you fall into the self. And the trouble with some constructed new religions is that they're still based on the self. If you try to construct your own religion, you're going to construct it around the things you like and the things you want. And actually at the heart of any serious faith is sacrifice. You're not supposed to get the things you want all the time. This is the story of Christ. Does he get the things he wants? No, he doesn't. He's crucified. He's tortured and dies. And through weakness, he becomes strong. You have to give up a lot of things for any serious faith. So you can't construct a religion that you just like the sound of, that has all the bits that flatter your ego, because even though it might seem spiritual, it ends up just expanding your will rather than, there's a difference between the famous Christian prayer, "Thy will be done," which happened, which occurs in the Lord's Prayer, and the kind of Aleister Crowley prayer, which is "Do what thou wilt." That's at the heart of neo-paganism in its various forms. You have to subdue your will to something. You have to make sacrifices. So it all starts there, and I think all cultures start there. They start with a belief in the way that you can get to God, which in Christianity is through Christ. And you follow that path, and you have to make sacrifices for it. You're supposed to carry a cross. In Christianity, it's not supposed to be fun. Christ tells you that if you follow this path, everyone's going to hate you, by the way. So it's not supposed to be comfortable. But the culture gets built around that. And that's true in non-Christian cultures too, right? There's always, as I say, there's always some sense of the sacred that people are prepared to sacrifice for because they believe it to be true. If you don't have that, if you're living in the self all the time, which we're encouraged to, the whole of our culture encourages us to just live according to the desires of the self every minute. I think you could usefully say that our society actually encourages every one of the 7 deadly sins, which I find quite intriguing. If you look at the list, right, all of them contribute to economic growth. So that's who we are, literally anti-Christ. So we gotta get out of that. And Christianity would certainly be one way to get out of that, yeah. But you have to believe it, you have to take that leap. But there are other cultures which are not Christian, and the strength is there as well. Whether the truth is there is another matter. But you don't have to be a Christian to create a society which is spiritually strong and has a sort of core and a sense of meaning to it. But I do think you have to have God at the heart of it.
I think the original term for apocalypse is the unveiling or whatever. You know, it's like through the apocalypse, our illusions are going to fall and we're going to be left with nothing but the truth, you know, and that's what gives me hope.
No, that's quite right. I mean, you know, the last book of the Bible is called the Book of Revelation, and Revelation in Greek is apocalypsis, which means, as you say, it's something being unveiled. So we use the word apocalypse to mean, you know, terrible collapse, zombie attack, but that's not what it means. It just means something will be revealed which was hidden. That's what an apocalypse is. So in other words, it shows you what was really going on all along. And that's exactly what this is. It is an apocalypse in that literal sense, because we are getting to see what the cogs of the machine really are. All the illusions fall away, the kind of veils of illusion fall away, and we go, okay, right, that's actually what the civilization that we're living in is, right? So, and I think you're absolutely right. You've got to go through it. You can't turn it around. And, you know, you have to look at it in historical terms. You have to look at the rise and fall of civilizations and cultures and empires. That always happens. It's happened forever and ever and ever. All the cultures that have ever existed up until now are dead, except the ones that are still here. And all the empires fall eventually. And this is just the biggest empire. It's the industrial empire. And we're watching it come down now, basically. And there isn't any way through that, around that at all. You have to go through it. The story that Christianity tells, the ancient Christianity tells about humans' relationship with God and the divine, which is also creation as well, seems to affirm the way I see society behaving and the way I see people behaving.
It's in alignment with reality.
It's in alignment with reality. So I look at the story of the fall, where we were once in communion and we chose power over humility. We chose the self over communion. We chose to rebel against God because we thought we could do it better. And I look around me at the state of the world and the changing climate and the attempt to build artificial intelligences, and I think, well, that looks like it's still going on. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, what's the way back to the garden? What's the way back to paradise? It's through the cross. It's humility. It's self-sacrifice. It's losing the ego. It's communion with everybody else. It's all the really hard stuff that none of us want to do. And that's, again, obviously true.